My name is Keshet Roman. I'm a reference librarian and the head of adult programming at the Irvington Public Library. I'm going to hand things over back to DeLaune and our speakers, but I'll be here in the background. If anyone has any questions for me or the Irvington Library, I'll be happy to answer them.
Thank you so much, Keshet. I really appreciate that introduction. And I am so thrilled tonight to have Jon and William here to celebrate William's new book. Jon Gertner is a journalist and historian whose stories on science, technology, and nature have appeared in a host of national magazines. Since 2003, he has worked mainly as a feature writer for the New York Times Magazine. His first book, The Idea Factory, Bell Labs and the Great Age of American Innovation, was a New York Times bestseller. His latest book, The Ice at the End of the World, An Epic Journey into Greenland's Buried Past and Our Perilous Future, was named one of the best books of the year by the Washington Post, the Christian Science Monitor, and Library Journal. A frequent lecturer on technology and science history, Gertner lives with his family in New Jersey. William Green, our guest tonight, celebrating his book, has written for many publications in the US and Europe, including Time, Fortune, Forbes, Fast Company, The New Yorker, The Spectator, and The Economist. He edited the Asian edition of Time while living in Hong Kong, then moved to London to edit the European, Middle Eastern, and African editions of Time. As an editor and co-author, William has collaborated on several books, including Guy Spears' much-praised memoir, The Education of a Value Investor. His newest book, here, has had foreign rights sold everywhere from China to South Korea, Japan to Germany, and the UK to Israel. Born and raised in London, William Green studied English literature at Oxford University and received a master's degree in journalism at Columbia University. He lives in New York with his wife and their 2 children. Will y'all please help me welcome William Green?
Thank you so much. So it's a particular pleasure to be here with you all. So really, I greatly appreciate you being here. And part of what's kind of a joy for me is the fact that DeLaune and Dan, who are both good friends of mine, created Book Yeah Yeah, which is an amazing organization. And so I'm really happy to be part of that. Then there's also the fact that I actually lived in Larchmont, where Larchmont Library is one of the sponsors of the event. And now I live in Irvington, which obviously is the other sponsor of the event. And then this triple pleasure of having Jon Gertner, a very old and dear friend, being the person to interrogate me is great as well. And so it's Jon was actually there when I first decided to become an editor about 20 years ago, and Jon decided to become a writer, and we actually switched. And we went to tell our boss at the time, we'd kind of like to change jobs, and so we go back a long way. And so one of the best magazine stories I ever edited was actually by Jon. So there's a certain lovely symmetry in the fact that we're here together. And as I said before, it's particularly nice that I can see people like my mother here from London, and my niece Sophie calling in, and cousins and strangers and friends. And so thank you all for being here. So I'm going to start off and I'm going to read the first 3 pages of the introduction of my book. And I'm somewhat self-conscious about this because historically a book tour would entail sitting in a store like Daunt on Marylebone High Street around the corner from my mother, and hoping that more than 7 people would show up and you would read. And actually this has been such a peculiar book tour that I've done remotely from home, sitting at my desk here in my study every day, that I actually haven't yet read this book to anyone. So I've answered a ton of questions about it, but I haven't actually read. So I timed myself before to see that it wouldn't go on for like 4 hours or something. And it should take about 6 minutes. But so if I look nervous, you'll actually understand that I'm a total rookie at reading my book, let alone reading it to people via Zoom from my study. So it's a novel experience, but thank you, bear with me. So the book starts, the introduction is called Inside the Minds of the Greatest Investors. I've been obsessed with investing for a quarter of a century. At first, it seemed an unlikely passion. I'd never taken a class in business or economics. I had no talent for numbers and no grasp of the esoteric mysteries of accounting. After leaving Oxford with a degree in English literature, I reviewed novels for magazines and wrote profiles of fraudsters and murderers. As an aspiring author with high-minded dreams of literary fame, I found it easy to dismiss Wall Street as a casino full of crass speculators who cared only about money. When the New York Times landed on my doorstep, I would jettison the business section without even glancing at it. But in 1995, I found myself with a bit of cash to invest, my half of the proceeds from the sale of an apartment that I owned with my brother. I began to read incessantly about stocks and funds, eager to increase my modest windfall. This reawakened in me a gambling streak that had briefly run wild when I was a teenager in England in the 1980s. At 15, when I was a student at Eton, I'd sneak out of school on lazy summer afternoons and spend hours at a local turf accountant near Windsor Castle, betting on horses while my classmates played cricket or went rowing. I was meant to become a posh English gentleman like Boris Johnson, Prince William, and 6 centuries of Etonians before us. Instead, I had an illegal betting account under the name of Mike Smith. My interest in horse racing was fueled not by the romance of the sport or the majesty of the equine form, but by a desire to make money without working. I took it seriously, jotting down elaborate notes about horses and courses, using multicolored ink pens to highlight my wins and losses. I ruined my 16th birthday by fighting with my parents over their refusal to buy me a subscription to Timeform, a pricey system for rating horses. I was outraged that they blocked this obvious route to untold riches. Shortly afterward, following a string of disillusioning losses, I renounced racing once and for all. A decade later, when I began to read about investing, I discovered that the stock market offered similar thrills, but the odds of success were much higher. Stocks struck me as the perfect way to cash in merely by outthinking other people. Of course, I had no idea what I was doing, but I had one inestimable advantage. As a journalist, I could indulge my new fixation by interviewing many of the best investors in the business. In the years that followed, I interviewed a pantheon of investment legends for Forbes, Money, Fortune, and Time, returning again and again to the same overarching questions that fascinate me to this day. What principles, processes, insights, habits, and personality traits enable this tiny minority to beat the market in the long run and become spectacularly rich? More important, how can you and I profit by studying these financial outliers and reverse engineering their winning ways? Those questions lie at the heart of this book. To my delight, many of the investors I encountered were fascinating and oddly exotic. I flew to the Bahamas to spend a day with Sir John Templeton, the greatest global stock picker of the 20th century, who lived in a Caribbean idyll called Lyford Key. I traveled to Houston for an audience with Faiz Sarafim, an enigmatic Egyptian billionaire nicknamed the Sphinx. In his office, he displayed paintings by El Greco and Willem de Kooning, along with a 5th century mosaic floor imported from a Syrian church. I spoke with Mark Mobius, the bald eagle, who flew around the developing world in a Gulfstream jet adorned with gold-plated fixtures and iguana skin upholstery purchased from a Middle Eastern tycoon who had fallen on hard times. I interviewed Michael Price, a polo-playing centimillionaire who terrorized underperforming CEOs and came to be known as the scariest SOB on Wall Street. I met Helmut Friedlander, who had fled from Germany in the 1930s, stopping only to pick up his teenage sister and to buy a hat, because a gentleman does not travel without a hat. He drank Chateau Petrus, collected precious medieval books, and traded everything from coffee futures to the Empire State Building. In his 90s, he told me, "I have lived uproariously." It was a priceless education. Jack Bogle, the index fund icon who founded Vanguard, which now manages $6.2 trillion, talked to me about the formative investment lessons he'd learned from his mentor and hero, a mutual fund pioneer named Walter Morgan. Don't get carried away. Don't take excessive risk. Keep your costs low. And the crowd is always wrong. As we shall see, Bogle also explained why you don't need to be great to thrive as an investor. Peter Lynch, Fidelity's most famous fund manager, talked to me about how he'd won by outworking everybody else. But he also spoke about the wild unpredictability of markets and the need for humility. You get a lot of A's and B's in school, he said. In the stock market, you get a lot of F's. And if you're right 6 or 7 times out of 10, you're very good. Lynch recalled one of his first failures. A high-flying apparel business went bust all because of the movie Bonnie and Clyde, which altered women's fashions so unexpectedly that the company's inventory became worthless. Ned Johnson, the multi-billionaire who built Fidelity into a behemoth, laughed and told Lynch, "You did everything right. Things come out of left field every now and then." In the tumultuous days after 9/11, when financial markets were suffering their worst week since the Great Depression, I headed to Baltimore to visit Bill Miller, who was in the midst of an unprecedented streak of beating the S&P 500 index for 15 years running. We spent a few days together and traveled in his Learjet, which he'd bought in part so that his 110-pound Irish wolfhound could fly with him. The economy was reeling, war was brewing in Afghanistan, and his fund had tumbled 40% from its peak. But Miller was relaxed and cheerful, coolly staking hundreds of millions of dollars on beaten-down stocks that subsequently soared. One morning, I was standing beside him when he rang his office to check in. The analyst on the other end of the line broke it to him that AES, a stock that Miller had only just bought, had announced terrible earnings. The stock halved, costing him $50 million before lunchtime. Miller instantly doubled his bet, calmly assuming that irrational investors had overreacted to the company's dismal news. As he explained to me, investing is a constant process of calculating the odds. It's all probabilities, he said. There is no certainty. And that's the start of the introduction.
So that was great. I think I'm going to chime in now. I think that's the process. Well, before I jump in with some questions, William, I realize there are probably two kinds of people visiting with us tonight, those who have read the book and maybe those who haven't. So I just wanted to say to the first group, because you'll get some of what the book is about from William's wonderful introduction or piece of the introduction, that I think will hopefully enlarge your understanding of what the book's about. But to the second group who hasn't read this book, let me note, as you probably gathered from the excerpt, that this isn't the kind of book that says put X dollars in the stock market or Y dollars in bonds. It's a beautifully written and rich mix of observations on markets and human behavior and decision making. And it's a book about people. I mean, not just the stars of the investment world who are fascinating, but about us and why we do dumb things all the time and why human behavior is sometimes our own worst enemy. And we'll talk about all that. Finally, keep in mind the title. I've read the book twice and it has already made me wiser. I think it's made me a little happier, and I presume it might soon make me richer. So there are not only some profound ideas here, but I think there's a lot of utility too. So that's a naked plug to buy the book, but also to take it out of the library, because I think the return on investment here is pretty high.
And the more copies you buy, the richer you become.
I think that's right. So on that note, let me jump in. William, I mean, as a writer myself, I often think it's kind of important to try and explain to non-writers that books don't start out as sleek commercial products that look wonderful in airport bookstores, but they actually arise from sleepless nights and agonized thinking and the would-be writer's struggles. Some of the people in the work you described in that passage you just read, I know goes back many decades, and I wondered if you could give us a little more backstory. I mean, how did you go from writing about investing on these individual profiles of people to sort of looking at this as material for a much more ambitious and connected book, where you would look at something more deeper and more connected about the meaning of investing, not just how to make money?
I think when you and I were first friends 20, 21, 22 years ago, and I was first interviewing people like Sir John Templeton or Jack Bogle or Fayez Sarafim, some of the people I mentioned in that passage, or Peter Lynch, I think I really cared about investing more as a kind of smart alecky game, where if I just thought well, I wouldn't actually have to work that hard. I could place a few bets and I would make money. And so it really was kind of a continuation of that early gambling fascination with horses. And then I think over the years, I interviewed so many of these great investors and my interest kind of deepened. And I started to realize that there was something actually really unique about them. And I'd say it became clear to me about 5, 6, 7 years ago, as I was working on a book called The Great Minds of Investing, which was a very idiosyncratic book it basically started out as these extraordinary photographs by one of the great portrait photographers who would be sort of this close to Buffett's face or Munger's face, taking these extraordinary close-ups. And I was writing short profiles to go with it. And because I interviewed a lot of people for that book, something like 22 people I interviewed who are famous investors, I started to think about it more deeply. And I started to realize that there was something about these people, the way that they thought, that was really quite profound. And they became a kind of incredible filter through which to see the world, because I started to realize they're almost like practical philosophers, that they're not wrestling with these very esoteric questions like, does this chair exist? Do we exist? Are we living in a simulation? They're thinking about things like, we're living in a world where the future is absolutely unknowable. Everything is changing constantly. And yet we have to somehow make intelligent decisions about the future. How do you do that? And what was striking to me was that unlike journalists like us, or academics, or philosophers with tenure at great Ivy League universities, they actually had skin in the game. And so if they were wrong, there was a tremendous price to pay. And if they were right, there were tremendous rewards. And it made me think of something I just realized I forgot to put in the book, which is, there's that beautiful line from Dr. Johnson where he said that the prospect of hanging concentrates the mind admirably. And I remember thinking, well, the prospect of losing money concentrates the mind admirably. And that for someone, say, like Howard Marks, who I write about, who I describe as the philosopher king of finance, here's a guy who was literally betting $500 to $600 million a week during the global financial crisis when the market was blowing up. So he's not only having to think right, he's actually, he ended up making a bet that made him $8 or $9 billion during that period when the world seemed to be ending. And so the quality of thinking of these people has to be extraordinarily high. And I think because of that, they become these remarkable pragmatists who they have a kind of agnostic approach to every aspect of life. So they'll just look for any advantage wherever they can find it. So they'll say, if I can find something from mindfulness meditation, great, I'll grab something from that. If I can find something from a 19th century algebraist who was a great thinker, great, I'll grab something from that. And or addiction literature, they'll literally study the science of addiction to figure out how to maintain equanimity during extreme periods. So I started to just think, well, if I could talk to the most interesting of these people, the wisest of them, the smartest of them, and could distill what they've figured out about how to succeed both in markets and life, that's actually going to help me tremendously. But it'll also help other people tremendously. And so that was kind of the grand plan, was to see if I could synthesize the thinking of really the smartest, wisest, and most thoughtful of these investors, rather than the ones who just had an incredible ability to make money, often at the expense of other people, and to line their pockets as much as possible. I was looking at people who actually were a tiny minority who were, I think, great thinkers.
Right. I do have a question for you about greed and greediness, which is sort of another kind of myth I think this book breaks down, because this group that you chose really, greed doesn't really enter into it in some ways. It's winning, and it's sort of understanding the world. But I'll come back to that, because you're sort of both in the piece that you read from the introduction, but as well as the things you're talking about. The book is really a select group of people, and I'd love to talk about them. But there are two people in the book, maybe three if we include Benjamin Graham, who kind of come up over and over again. They're the sons of the investing solar system, and that would be Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger. I mean, for those of us who just think of them as two rich billionaires who are kind of getting, a little old in their ways now, can you explain a bit about why they're so important? Not just because they're rich, but why they're so influential and such kind of, I guess, a rich wellspring of wisdom.
I think they're partly important because of the manner of their victory. It's not just the enormity of the victory.
Okay. And how big is the victory? Well, just for people who don't know their
I was
success.
Looking at the Berkshire Hathaway annual report that came out a couple of weeks ago, and I think their cumulative return of Berkshire Hathaway over something like 55 years is 2.8 million%. I mean, it's quite stunning. And so they've done something that's absolutely extraordinary. And they have I think it's something like 360,000 people work for Berkshire Hathaway. But it's also the reason why people like me go to Omaha for the Berkshire Hathaway meeting is because they're kind of this crotchety old couple. They're a bit like the odd couple, like Walter Matthau and Jack Lemmon, sitting there kind of wisecracking and telling you the truth. So you have Buffett, who could be charging any amount he wanted. He gives himself a salary of $100,000 a year. Munger takes no salary. So their interests are entirely aligned with the interests of their shareholders. They make money if the company does well. They're not trying to gouge you. They're not trying to rip you off. And there's a wonderful line that I quote from a foreword to a biography of Charlie Munger that Buffett wrote, where he said, in 41 years, I've never seen Charlie try to take advantage of anyone. And he said, I've seen him knowingly take the worst side of a deal a number of times. And he always takes more of the blame for anything and less of the credit. And so I think there's something about the fact that they represent these old values of sort of honor and transparency and decency. And I'm not saying they're ideal. I mean, Munger, who I interviewed for the book, is famously brusque and rude. I mean, he was very charming to me, but he's a terrifying guy. I mean, there's a wonderful story that I tell that came actually from a $650,000 lunch that two friends of mine had with Buffett many years ago, where the money went to charity. And Buffett told them this story about Munger going to the DMV to get his license renewed, which is a terrifying thought, given that he was already about 90 and had one glass eye. And the guy in the DMV said to him, and do you still just have one eye? And he said, no, I've grown another one. And so Munger always had this, he said, I always had a gift for recognizing twaddle. And so there's something kind of brusque and rude about him, but at the same time, honest and direct. And so I think partly it's the fact that they're these truth tellers in an industry that's riddled with self-interest, deceit, people lining their own pockets at your expense. You have these two old guys who are actually going to behave honorably, and that's kind of wonderful.
Yeah, one of my favorite Charlie Munger stories in the book is where he talks about, he's obviously very interested in not to be a fool and not to fall into sort of bad habits and sin. And he talks about how, or you sort of summarize him, where he talks about the seven deadly sins, and he talks about envy as being the dumbest sin and one you have to avoid, especially because it's not even fun, which I thought was really funny. Can you talk about, just to give us a little more insight into how someone like Charlie Munger thinks, which you do so entertainingly in the book, what are a couple, one thing he uses is inversion, which maybe you could talk about a little bit as a sort of, I guess I'm trying to sort of say, maybe you can sort of explain how their thinking is so kind of iconoclastic or at least unorthodox in some ways.
Yeah, Munger is famously brilliant, right? This is the place to start. I mean, we have to recognize that Monish Pabrai, a guy I write about at great length, who told me once he has an IQ in the 180s, said to me that Munger is a quantum leap above Warren Buffett in terms of intelligence. And if you think that Buffett is a genius, that gives you a sense of just how bright Munger is. And Munger is this extraordinary polymath who's just going around every discipline, trying to take the biggest ideas from every discipline, mental models, he calls them. And he creates this kind of lattice work of mental models from all these different areas. And so I mentioned before that these guys will take something from, say, a 19th century algebraist and say, oh yeah, I'll grab that because that'll work. And so this is precisely what Munger did. So he said, okay, there's this guy, Carl Gustav Jacobi, who in the 19th century was this algebraist, German algebraist, who said, invert, always invert. And so Munger takes this principle and he says, so how do you invert in investing and life? And so what he does is he says, well, if you want to be a great investor, you start by saying, let me figure out what would make me a terrible investor. And so you actually collect all of these examples of what he calls asininities and inanities and absurdities, all of the ways in which people blow themselves up doing stupid things. So for example, you'll find, we just had this recently, this guy, Bill Huang, who's a multi-billionaire, I gather, who just blew himself up totally using leverage, using borrowed money. And as Buffett used to say, if, when you invest, when you're already rich and you invest borrowed money, it's kind of like marrying for money when you're already rich. It's just really dumb. And people continue to do this sort of stuff. And so Munger collects these examples of inanities and then says, okay, let me see the reason for this disaster. And then let me work backwards and say, well, let me avoid that. And so he had a friend who was a famous academic, a guy called Garrett Hardin, who was an ecologist, if I remember rightly. And he said Garrett Hardin really influenced his thinking on this. And Hardin would say, if you want to figure out how to help India, first figure out how to ruin India. And so this is a really interesting approach where basically you're solving problems backwards. And so Munger says, yeah, you want to solve problems forwards. You want to think about, how do I get to where I want to be? But you also want to solve them backwards and say, how do I avoid a catastrophe? And so he said, it's just a more thorough way of thinking. And so he's going through life just being super rational in all of these ways. So for example, he's looking constantly for what he calls disconfirming evidence. So one of his great inspirations was Darwin, because he said, here you had a guy who actually was really devoutly religious and yet was prepared in his search for the truth about evolution to destroy what Munger would call his most cherished beliefs. And so Munger would say, any year where you fail to destroy one of your most cherished beliefs is a wasted year. Mm-hmm. So if you think about the period that we've just come through politically, and the fact that we're all kind of looking for confirmation of our own biases and prejudices when it comes to politics or anything else, here you have someone who's very consciously saying, no, let me figure out what the other side of the argument is, and let me actually be able to make that side of the argument better than that person can make the argument themselves. And so that sort of idea from him is just it's a beautiful example of how to think better. So he for example, he's a Republican, and he doesn't like Paul Krugman, for example, the New York Times columnist, but he thinks he's a great writer. So he makes a point of reading Paul Krugman the whole time. Mm-hmm. That's a really interesting example of something where he's consciously challenging his own views. And this is one of the things that actually got cut out of that chapter, and I don't know whether it was right to cut it out. Is he was originally against abortion, and gradually over the years changed his mind and became pro-choice. And if you think about how few of us actually change our mind about such an incendiary, divisive issue, it's kind of an extraordinary thing. And likewise, he ended up voting against Trump in the last election. And so my editor was like, no, don't go into politics. And I'm wary of mentioning it here. But I think that's a reflection of how open-minded he tries to be. And it's interesting that the Buffett is actually a staunch Democrat. Yeah. Munger is traditionally a Republican. And yet they say they've not had an argument in 50 years. So there's something also kind of lovely about that relationship. I think that the decency, the openness, the transparency, and Buffett refers to Munger as the abominable no man, because Munger is the one person who's smart enough to challenge him, and actually say, no, you're wrong to sell Apple stock, for example.
Mm-hmm. He probably was wrong.
Probably, yeah.
One of the disciples of both men who you mentioned very briefly. Another one of the characters in the book, actually, the way you start the book is, I hope I'm pronouncing his name right, Manish Pabrai.
Yeah.
Born in India, self-made millionaire, and now, I guess, much more than a millionaire investor. And he's a character that just jumps off the page. He's blunt, he's brilliant, he's successful. He doesn't seem to worry what other people think of him. Can you talk a little bit about Manish? I mean, I was going to call Manish unique, but I think that that's a little bit of a wordplay, because Manish's whole idea is not to be unique. It's about copying everybody. But yeah.
Yeah, he's a wonderfully flamboyant character. And actually, when I first decided to work on the book about 5 years ago, which I'm embarrassed to say that it took me the best part of 5 years, he was the very first person that I decided to go report with. And so we actually arranged to go to India together, and we ended up traveling for 5 days in India together. And I had interviewed him multiple times already, but the reason I was so fascinated.
Now you actually shared a train car with him once, right? Like a
we
car?
Slept in a bunk bed together on an all-night train ride from I think Kota to Mumbai.
Sorry to interrupt. Keep going.
No, it was wonderful, and I mean that very, very intimate reporting. And I was saying to you yesterday when we were chatting briefly, there was one moment where I asked him something about his marriage, which subsequently ended in divorce, and he said, "Turn off your tape recorder, and I'll tell you." And that was the only time he didn't wanted, I would ask him the most impertinent personal questions, and he would answer everything. I mean, at one point I said to him, I emailed him, I said, what's your net worth these days? And he wrote back and he said, $153 million, but it doesn't include this, 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 and this. And so he's obsessed with honesty, which made him a wonderful person to interview. Mm-hmm. And the thing that's fascinating about Monish, which is the reason why I started the book with him, is that basically in 1994, he was killing time in Heathrow Airport, and he starts reading a book by Peter Lynch, and he sees for the first time a mention of Warren Buffett's returns. And he sees basically that Buffett had returned, I think, 31% a year over 45 years. And because Monish is a great math whiz, he says, okay, so that means he's doubled his money 18 times. So here's the winner of the compounding game. And this guy's going to end up being the richest man on earth. And so he starts thinking, well, so wait a second, if Buffett has managed in that time to turn $1 into $145,000, which is basically what that return meant, he said, so he's averaged 31% a year. I should be able to reverse engineer what he's done and average 26% a year. And because I understand compounding, that's going to mean I'm going to turn my $1 million that I've just managed to save into $1 billion. So he launches this 30-year game basically to reverse engineer Buffett and Munger and turn $1 million into $1 billion. And so I tell the story in that first chapter of how he figures out basically the laws of investing, which he says are like the financial laws, they're the equivalent of the laws of physics, but within finance. And he says Buffett and Munger have basically revealed the laws of investing, and yet all of these morons out there are playing this game without any idea of what the rules of the game are. And so he says, if no one else will do it, the Indian guy will do it. And so there's something wonderful about the combination of this deep intelligence, this sort of ferocious intelligence of saying, no, I'm going to figure out this game, even though I've never been to business school. I have no track record as an investor. I mean, there was nothing to qualify him to win this game, but he decides. So that intense intelligence and ferocity of his obsessiveness, combined with this idea that he's just going to clone, which is his term for replication or modeling, that he's not going to try to be original. He's just going to rip off everything that Buffett and Munger have figured out. And this to me raises really interesting and profound questions, which is why I wanted to write about Monish, because we're also obsessed with trying to be original. And you wrote a great book about innovation at Bell Labs, and so I mean here you are sort of celebrating innovation, and Monish in a way is the nemesis of this, right? I mean he's saying no, let me just figure out what people who are wiser and smarter than me have already figured out, and instead of reinventing the wheel, I'm going to win this game by cloning that. And I think that raises fascinating questions about whether most of us actually, unless we're truly profound thinkers, truly radical thinkers, should actually be focusing on this low-hanging fruit of trying to reverse engineer and mimic and replicate what people who are smarter than us have already figured out. Mm-hmm. But then there's this kind of caveat, which I talk about at the end of the chapter, which is that I think you have to do it in a way that's actually true to your own temperament and skills. And so I do think this idea of cloning is an extraordinarily profound idea, both in investing and other areas of life. But it's dangerous because, for example, Monish during the financial crisis in 2008, 2009 was down 67% at one point. And I said to him, did you find it, how did you deal with the stress? And he said, I don't feel stress. And he said, my wife at the time didn't even know that there was a problem. And he said, on the contrary, he said it was orgasmic because prices were so low. And so for me to try to clone Monish when I'm a sort of neurotic worrier who's sort of afraid of the world falling apart just wouldn't work because I don't have that temperament. But
I'm sorry. It's also interesting when you said it can be complicated. It also seems, and you talk about this a little bit, is that the idea is, how would I say, or is it a hall of mirrors? It can go deeper than you think. Monish is cloning Buffett, but in a way, Buffett was cloning Benjamin Graham to some extent, you talk about other writers, Oliver Sacks, that maybe it's sort of what Newton said. We're all standing on the shoulders of other people. That you can kind of go back in time. That even the people you think are original, maybe not maybe aren't as original as we think.
Yeah, and I found that very thrilling and beautiful. One of the things that I was doing throughout the book was trying to find these ideas that actually run through many different fields. And so I wasn't just writing about investing. And so when I'm writing about cloning, I start to look for these other areas in which this applies. And I was really thrilled to see that Oliver Sacks, who's this writer who I was trying to clone because he's extraordinary, actually talked in one of his books about trying to clone A.R. Luria, who is this great Russian writer and psychologist who wrote a book called something like The Mind of the Mnemonist, which was about a guy with an infinite memory. And so there you have Oliver Sacks writing all these case studies of extraordinary patients of his that he uses a kind of leaping off point to explore other issues. And then he actually talked about when he discovered A.R. Luria, kind of tearing up a manuscript of his, if I remember rightly, because he was sort of despairing. He's like, it's all been done before. I've done nothing, nothing original. And then when I went, because I'm sort of obsessive about these things, and I read A.R. Luria, I see that A.R. Luria says basically that he was inspired by a book by Walter Pater that was published in, I think, the 1880s called Imaginary Portraits. And so there's something really wonderful that kind of, as you kind of unravel this thing, you discover that actually they're all cloning. They're all standing on the shoulders of giants.
But it's a wonderful chapter, and he's certainly larger than life. Makes you want to sort of spend the day with him just to like sort of, you can hear that big booming voice.
Yeah.
I'll just cover a couple more people in there. I mean, one of the themes in here, I think you might have touched on it a little bit before, but there's this theme of failure and recovery and setbacks. It comes up again and again in here. There's one character, I think, one investor in your book who's having an awful couple of years. And I think he says something like, he finds that there's this disconnect suddenly between process and outcome. He's doing the same things he's always done, the same things that gained so much approval, so much celebratory pats on the back, so much success, and yet all of a sudden everything's gone to crap and nothing's working for him. But maybe Bill Miller is a good example, or maybe this fellow Evellard. Can you talk about what failure means to some of these people you talk to? I mean, these are people who are wealthy. Even failure is not going to make them poor, but how is it kind of useful to them? How is it sort of illuminating? How do they use it?
Yeah, the guy you were mentioning is a guy called Jason Karp, who's a fascinating character. He was an extraordinary character. And he looked like a G.I. Joe, very handsome, very charming, really smooth, came in the top 4 of his class at Wharton, and was kind of a nationally ranked squash player and athlete. And he was just someone who everything he touched turned to gold. And so he's running this fund. He sets up a hedge fund, and he immediately attracts something like $4.5 billion. I think it was the fastest startup of any hedge fund ever. And so he has great returns. Everyone is asking, what's your secret sauce? And he'd come originally from the firm that was the inspiration for Billions, if any of you have seen the show Billions. And he was kind of the star within that firm. And so he was kind of a remarkable guy. And then suddenly everything starts to go wrong. He makes a series of bad bets, one of which was on Valiant, this kind of scummy pharmaceutical company. And he was thinking, yeah, it's toxic, but it's not quite as toxic as people believe. So I'm going to make money, which is a sort of characteristically shrewd kind of insight into how to make money. But he was wrong. And he said that when he was a child, he had been obsessed with playing computer games. And he said it was actually an incredible training for being a money manager, because he said, you're dying all of the time in these computer games, and yet you have to start again and keep going. And he said, that's basically what I'm doing all the time as a money manager. And so I was kind of impressed with him and thought he was really charming and really candid. And then I kind of lost touch with him. And then a couple of years later, I see that he's closed down his fund and he's returned all of the money. And I managed to catch up with him. And I sort of said, so what happened? And he basically said, I was clinically depressed during this time that I was running my fund. And he said, I was clinically depressed during the time that I was my most successful. And I was clinically depressed during the time when it was all going wrong. And he said, the thing that was really difficult was that you're working unbelievably hard and you're being judged constantly. And your process may be really smart, but you don't have control over the outcome. And so he said, it's actually like being a rat in a science experiment where, you know, you reach out to the lever and you push the lever, and sometimes it gives you a cookie, and sometimes you reach out and it gives you an electric shock, and you can't tell which is which. And so he said that's actually how they induce madness in these lab animals. And so it's a really fascinating idea that most of us think, when we think about really wealthy money managers, that they just absolutely have it made. But in fact, what you're seeing is that these guys are kind of tortured some of the time. And so I think for someone like Buffett or Munger, they have this tremendous advantage, which is that they actually don't have much in the way of emotion. So for them, when I said to Munger during the financial crisis, when everything was falling apart in 2008, 2009, did you actually feel these emotions like fear and anxiety? And he said, no, not at all. And I said, well, what about Warren? He said, no, Warren's wired exactly the same way. He doesn't feel it either. But for regular humans, I think it's an enormously difficult job. And you're just going through extreme intensity with little control and being judged over the short term. And your shareholders can yank out their money at any time, and you're publicly being derided for your stupidity. And so one of the reasons why I found this so interesting is because they became a really interesting way just to look at resilience, at how you build resilience. And so someone like Bill Miller, who you mentioned before, who's a philosopher. I mean, he was a spook who then became a philosopher, and then became a money manager. He's drawing on Stoic philosophy to enable him to deal with the pain of investing. And so I write at some length about him going through this period where he had been kind of the most famous, most successful mutual fund manager of his generation. And then he just publicly disgraces himself. And his solution was really to use Stoic philosophers like Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius and say, okay, so what can I control and what can't I control? And how do I behave honorably? And how do I, instead of trying to redeem my reputation, how do I just try to be honest about my mistakes and have good humor and control what I can control? And so for me, part of why I was interested in this stuff is because, you know, I've had my failures, I've had my setbacks. And so I'm looking at these guys thinking, so actually, how do you deal with public shame, with public failure, with setbacks, with stress? How do you achieve equanimity? And in the same way that I mentioned before, that these guys are these just great pragmatists, I just think they're really, really smart at figuring out ways to build resilience and equanimity.
Well, one other thing, thank you. That's fascinating, and it's fascinating in the book too. One other thing that strikes me repeatedly in reading the book is their patience, their ability to sort of sometimes wait. And we talked about sort of how they've tried, or some of them either have very little in the way of emotions, or are able to sort of observe their emotions and sort of subdue them. I think maybe it goes to that sort of notion that most people have of money managers kind of constantly putting in orders on the computer and stuff. But some of the people in your book, some of these sort of more admirable investors, they just kind of go into an office and just kind of sit there all day and read. And sometimes literally years go by, am I right, where they don't even buy anything?
Yeah, I mean, Munger has this beautiful image of great investors as being spear fishermen. And so he says basically the whole job is you wait by the side of the stream, and most of the time you do absolutely nothing. And then once in a while, a fat, juicy salmon comes past and you spear it. And then you go back to doing nothing. And it may be 6 months before another salmon goes by. And so if you look at Berkshire Hathaway at the moment, everyone's complaining that they're doing nothing, and they're sitting on $145 billion in cash that's making them nothing. And they're just quietly waiting for things to fall apart, or for some huge opportunity to come by where some massive company gets in distress and they can buy it. And it's so countercultural in a way. If you think all of us are being kind of, as I mentioned in the book, dinged and clickbaited the whole time. We're constantly being bombarded with messages on Twitter and Facebook and LinkedIn and calls to meetings. And there's this constant pressure to do stuff that's short term. And I think part of what's so interesting about these investors is that they've set themselves up counterculturally to say, well, what matters over the long term, and not to make very many decisions. And so Buffett famously said, we're paid not for activity, but for being right. And so I think that requires extreme self-discipline. And one of the points that Monish made that I thought was really interesting is that he said that Buffett's obsession with playing online bridge, which he does with Bill Gates a lot, has actually saved Berkshire Hathaway's shareholders an enormous amount of money, because he said it's really hard for these big engines to sit idle. And so if you have Buffett using his big engine to play bridge the whole time, it helps him actually do nothing. And so it's a really interesting idea for most of us, I think, that I think it's actually a competitive advantage in life. If when everyone else is becoming more short-term and more obsessed with instant gratification, if you can subtly tilt the balance in your life to say, no, let me focus, for example, on reading books rather than replying to Twitter messages, or let me meditate more, let me do less and meditate more, because actually then my mind is going to be more of a calm pond and my decisions will be better. And I think it doesn't come naturally to us, because we're in most areas of life, you're rewarded for being dynamic. And yet this is one area where actually doing nothing is incredibly powerful. And so, I mean, Buffett famously in the early 1970s basically couldn't find anything to buy at all. And then the market fell apart in about 73, 74. And he bought an enormous stake in the Washington Post, which he then owned for the next 40 years.
Mm-hmm. Right. It's a wonderful way to think about productivity, or to think differently about productivity.
This is my excuse for my own laziness, I think.
You only have to write a book every 5 years. That's all that matters. Well, in the middle of while you were writing, the pandemic happened, and I wondered, what did that do? I guess both for your own work in writing this book, but also for all these people you've been following. All of a sudden, things were thrown into chaos. What did it mean for them? I mean, I guess it meant opportunity for some of them. For others, did it mean not so much fear, but what happened?
Yeah, I went back and I re-interviewed about 16 of the investors. So overall, I spent probably hundreds of hours interviewing 40 or so of these great investors for the book. And suddenly I'd finished the book more or less. And then COVID happens. And I was like, well, my editor's pressuring me just to be done. But how can I just add a few paragraphs here and there? I've got to actually, update it and figure out what, this is one of the biggest things in the history of our lifetime. How are they responding to it? And the thing that was really fascinating to me was just how consistent it was with everything else I knew about them. The way they responded was so consistent. So I write about this guy, for example, called Ed Thorpe, who I describe in the introduction of the book as the greatest game player in the history of investing. And Thorpe is a guy, he's actually the guy who figured out how to count cards. He figured out how to beat the casino at blackjack. Mm-hmm. Then he figured out how to beat the casino at roulette, which is a mugs game for centuries. And he created, with this guy Claude Shannon from MIT, the first wearable computer, which he would basically trigger furtively with the big toe in his shoe. And so he could see how fast the ball and the rotor wheel were going. And so he could calculate which of the 38 pockets the ball was more likely to land in. So I said to him, okay, so you had a hedge fund that didn't lose money in any quarter in 20 years. You beat the casino at blackjack. You beat the casino at roulette. How have you thought about COVID? And he's like, thank you for asking. And he then proceeds to explain in this beautiful way that's so consistent with everything else that he had done, that basically he totally distrusted any of the data from the government, didn't believe anything that anyone was saying. And so very early on, I think in about January 2020, before anyone had died in the US, when we were still looking at all of the figure, when we were basically thinking, well, this is a distant thing happening in China, why should any of us care? He started to analyze the data from Wuhan and calculated his own fatality rate, his own estimate of the fatality rate based on inferences from the 1918 flu pandemic as well, which had killed his grandfather. And so he's just very objectively looking at the data in exactly the same way that everyone had said to him, well, you can't win at blackjack or you can't win at roulette. He's like, well, just because people say that that's the case, that doesn't mean anything to me. I'm going to analyze the data for myself, especially when it's something important. And so in about February 2020, before a single death had been announced in the US, he gathers his entire family together in California and he says to them, over the next 12 months, I think there'll be between 200,000 and 500,000 deaths in the US from this new coronavirus. And he said, we need to start getting supplies now. And so they go off and they get masks and they get hand wipes and all that stuff a month before the shelves are cleaned out by everyone else, when everyone else suddenly realizes it's a problem. And then he says, yeah, and we're going to go into isolation, because he was, I think, 86 at the time. So he said to me, I have no comorbidities. I'm very fit. He'd run 21 marathons over the years, and his diet was very healthy. So he's like, I'm in pretty good shape. But he said, my odds of dying if I get COVID it's somewhere between 2 and 4%. And he's like, that's still plenty high. So I thought there was something really fascinating about the fact that he's actually calculating his own odds of death. And there's something so, I think, quintessentially Thorpean. This guy Ed Thorpe, he's like, he's not going to trust anyone's analysis of the data. He's going to crunch the data for himself. And then he's going to make this decision that's totally probabilistic. It's totally based on the odds. And so he's saying the worst thing you can do, both in investing and life, is to get knocked out of the game. It's kind of like if you're at the casino, you want to just be able to stay in the game. And so there was something really interesting about that, just the emphasis on avoidance of catastrophe. And that's one of the things I think that's had the biggest effect on me in writing and reporting the book, is you just see, well, as one of the other great investors said to me, you need to survive the dips. And I think all of these great investors, they have this tremendous emphasis on survival. If you can stay in the game, if you can remain relatively defensive, so you just don't get knocked out of the game, you'll kind of be fine. And I think that applies to investing, but it also applies to COVID. It's like, yeah, so maybe it's pretty smart for me to wear my mask, and for me not to go out too much, and for me not to go drinking in nightclubs and stuff, And so I kept thinking about this while I was working on the book. I was like, yeah, well, maybe I'm stupid, and maybe I should be out there and should be socializing more. And then I was like, no, I kind of actually just want to survive this dip. Mm-hmm. And also have faith that, as I write in the book, the sun also rises, that you go through these difficult periods, but actually, yeah, it passes. And so you want to position yourself to survive these very difficult periods, so that you stay in the game.
Sure. I just, I noticed the time, it went very fast. Are we, DeLaune, are we running out, or do we take a question or two?
Yeah, you could, there aren't any. Y'all are so fabulous. This discussion is absolutely brilliant. Jon, would you like to wrap up with one last question? And or William, is there something that I can't imagine there's tons that y'all could talk about, but Jon
any more
was,
questions from Jon?
Jon
sure,
was so amazing. Yeah,
I do. The book is filled with the famous and the famous people, as well as people who are famous amongst investing, but yet you end it with the story of a Holocaust survivor, a very obscure man named Arnold. I have it here written down.
Vandenberg,
who I had never heard about. Can you tell me tell us a little bit about who he was, and why did you end the book with him? I don't think it's not really a spoiler alert, or anything like that.
Yeah, he's an obscure character, and I explain at the end of that chapter. There's a section at the end of the chapter. The subtitle of the chapter is "I'm the richest man in the world," which is something that he said to me. And he said, that's not because I have a ton of money. That's because I have my health, I have these amazing relationships, all of these other things. And I write about Arnold, who I regard as the most successful human being I've encountered in the investment world. And so I'm trying to use him in the epilogue of the book, at the very end of the book, to say what actually constitutes a truly abundant and successful life. And Arnold is an extraordinary character because he was dealt the worst hand of any of these investors. And so Ed Thorpe, who we talked about before, said, well, you're dealt a hand like with your health and stuff, and then through your choices, you decide how well you're going to play that hand. And so Thorpe had all of these advantages, like being a genius. Arnold was born in 1939, I think, on the same street as Anne Frank, right after the Nazis had invaded, and was in a Jewish family that was basically hidden behind a false wall, a fake wall in a Christian family's home nearby in Amsterdam. And so starts off in hiding for the first couple of years of his life. Then his parents decide, well, if he starts crying when the Nazis come and explore the house, come to investigate, they're actually going to take us all and put us all in Auschwitz, and the first people to die would be the children. And so he and his brother Sigmund would be most at risk. And so they made this kind of terrible gamble where basically they get this this person from the resistance movement to smuggle him out of Amsterdam to an orphanage in the countryside. And he spent the next few years basically in hiding in this orphanage, a Christian orphanage, where he ate so little that by the time his parents, who survived Auschwitz, they were caught and went to Auschwitz. And by the time they got out and came to rescue him, he didn't recognize them. And basically he couldn't walk. He was shuffling around on his knees. And I don't mention this in the book, but he told me an extraordinary story where he said that many years later he was going to visit his parents, and he and his wife bought some flowers for his parents. And he said in the car, he just started to cry uncontrollably. And he said he had no idea what was going on. And he later realized that those flowers were the flowers that he used to eat in the field when he was in this orphanage. And so he had this sort of terrible flashback. And so he just started kind of with the worst hand. And even, I mean, you sort of think, well, these poor tragic victims, they were all sort of wonderful human beings. And then you're like, well, actually, life is more complicated. And it turned out that his father, after surviving Auschwitz, used to beat him up. And so he came from this very, very tough home, moves to East Los Angeles to a very poor neighborhood, where on his very first day at school, his mother dresses him up in lederhosen and long socks. So he gets beaten up by all the kids. I think he got in about 3 fights on his first day at school. And one day here's a psychologist talking to his mom and saying, well, yeah, I think probably his brain was damaged by all of this malnutrition when he was a little boy. And that's probably why he's not so smart. And so he grew up thinking he was stupid, full of anger and fury towards the Nazis, full of resentment towards his parents, and yet over decades managed to transform himself to this extraordinarily loving, kind, generous, decent, successful human being. And so ending with that story enabled me to explore a couple of different things. One of which is the extraordinary importance of taking control of your inner landscape. That however rich you are, if you don't have control over your thoughts and your emotions, it's very, very hard to be happy. And so that guy, Jason Karp, I talked about before, who at his most successful was still clinically depressed. I think that points to the same thing. And Arnold Vandenberg, this character at the end of the book, would literally do things where he would hypnotize himself, and he would use affirmations. I mean, he barely made it through high school. And so he had none of the intellectual snobbishness of someone like me who'd gone to all of these sort of posh schools and would kind of roll my eyes at the thought of, using affirmations or self-hypnosis, which I don't roll my eyes at anymore because I've seen how extraordinarily it's worked with someone like Arnold. So he would go around saying to himself over and over again, I am a loving person. And so he actually managed to remove this kind of hatred and fury and desire for revenge, and did actually become this extraordinarily loving person. And the other thing I write about with Arnold is just the sheer joy that he takes in helping other people. And so there's something really wonderful about him as a kind of embodiment of seeing, the money is really valuable because it enabled him, as he put it, not to take shit from anybody, because that was really important for him. I mean, those were his words. He's like, I don't want anybody telling me what to do. And so making money enabled him to take control of his own life. But then once he had made a certain amount of money, it was just to share, and he was just constantly taking care of other people. And in fact, I mean, when I fact checked the chapter, the one thing that he pleaded with me to take out were some of the details of people that he had helped, which I thought was really interesting when you think of the number of people who are sort of giving money to hospitals so that they can sort of have the wing named after them. And here's this guy who's actually like, no, please, if you mention that I helped this particular person, he'll never take money from me again. Mm. And he's very proud, and it'll really hurt him. And I could see that it was traumatizing him. And just the delight that he takes in helping other people is kind of extraordinary. And so I was trying to give a sense that an abundant life is not, it's not just about the money. It's got to have this key level, this key aspect of equanimity, peace of mind. And then I think it's got to have built in this greater purpose beyond your own ego. There's got to be an element of sharing. Yeah. And I see that with someone like Monish, who we talked about before, where Monish says, yeah, I'm going to end up making $1 billion. I'm going to turn this $1 million into $1 billion, and I'm going to end with nothing. I'm going to give every penny away. And already he's taken this extraordinary gift that he has for making money by making by spearing salmon every once in a while. And he's used it actually to educate thousands of children in India who have extremely high IQs and come from very, very poor families. And he basically pays to have them coached to get into the Indian equivalent of MIT. And so he's sort of dragging these kids out of poverty who have tremendous talent but very little opportunity. And so I think when I look at someone like Monish, or when I look at someone like Arnold, you can see that there's one reason why I think they're happier than most, is that there's some greater purpose beyond their own ego.
Yeah, no, I think that really comes through in the book. Obviously, people who know much about Buffett know he's giving tons of money as well, and it obviously goes to sort of so much of the theme of the book that richness or wealth is not about just money or returns in so many ways. I guess I suppose I'm supposed to rein you in. I'm sure we could continue.
Well, but what a beautiful note to end on. Jon and William, that was such a great hour. I know I speak for everyone when I say I was hanging on every word, and I could have listened to y'all for hours and hours more. Fortunately, we have William's book that we can all read. Yep. But everyone, please unmute and help me thank William and Jon for that incredibly inspiring and wonderful discussion.
Thank you so much.
And I will let Kashette say goodnight to everybody, but thank you so much for this beautiful evening.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you all.